This video involves a couple of theists comparing the universe to tacos because acronyms sell, I guess. I'm going to skip the first minute and a half as it's an uncomfortably racist introduction to a book that's being peddled. I'll say this much, though, before I get started. Eric Hernandez comes across as a much more well-educated and respectable man than the racist, unhinged psychopath that co-hosts this video with him.
The T is for teleological. Eric, give us one of the many teleological arguments for the existence of God.
Yeah, so you've got a few. Teleology basically means it infers design, and you have the fine-tuning of the universe, that in order for life to exist, the parameters need to be so fine-tuned, and if they were just off by a hair's margin, no life at all would exist.
Your opening gambit is the fine-tuning argument? Seriously? Here's my main problem with the fine-tuning argument. It assumes that there could have been something else, but we don't know that. The laws of nature and the physical constants could be fixed. They could just exist as a result of some deeper quantum phenomenon or theory of quantum gravity. They could arise as a result of natural laws we don't fully understand, not as things that were fine-tuned by a creator. They could simply be brute facts, unchangeable features of reality that don't require further explanation. If these constants and laws can't be any other way, then they're not fine-tuned, they just are. Oh, and before you complain about how brute facts don't make sense without some ultimate grounding, keep in mind your argument for an all-powerful creator is the exact same thing with just a mind attached to it. If these constants and laws are somehow malleable, that is, they can differentiate, it still doesn't mean that there was a mind that tuned them. It could just mean that we don't yet know how they can vary, and that doesn't point to a designer. It's also possible that we don't know what combination of constants and laws would result in some form of life. Maybe that life doesn't resemble us, but it's premature to say that no life could exist at all with a different set of constants. Do you have the simulation data to suggest that life in any conceivable form is impossible, given a nearly infinite configuration of laws and constants? No? Then you don't have an argument, you have unsupported speculation. Finally, we don't need to assume an anthropocentric position. Even if life depends on some kind of fine-tuning, it does not follow that this fine-tuning occurred for life. For example, if we grant fine-tuning as a brute fact of the universe, it could be possible that this occurred because a sufficiently advanced species created a Genesis bomb that caused the Big Bang, and the fine-tuning was necessary to wipe out all hostile life in this segment of reality. We just happen to be an artifact from that moment.
And so we can look at something like that, and the idea is we can detect signs of design there.
That's right.
And as you pointed out, there are other versions of there are versions that are based on biology and the complexity of DNA and complexity of life and things like that. All kinds of them in chemistry, biology, physics, and so on. And so the gist, this taco, if I saw it, and I had never seen a taco in my entire life at any point, I could look at it, examine it carefully, and realize that it is designed. The shell, the meat, the tomatoes, the cheese, the hot sauce. They don't form like this by nature. They have to be put in this formation by a designer. That is teleology. Taco teleology.
The universe, indeed reality, isn't a taco. It's not as neat and orderly as something that is assembled at a mass-produced fast food restaurant where every element is placed with a specific purpose and goal in mind. When you look at a taco, you can clearly see distinct parts intentionally placed together to create something that fulfills a specific purpose, something that we recognize as a taco. When it comes to the universe, what exactly is being arranged and by what intent? Where? The universe doesn't show distinct parts being purposefully placed together like a taco shell with meat and cheese. It's just a mindless process unfolding according to natural laws. When you put meat in a shell and cover it with cheese and sauce, you have an agent that has decided the taco must exist. But when we look at the universe, and specifically the universe's past, we don't see direct separate objects being placed together to form reality. We don't see empty space being populated with planets and stars arranged in some intentional order. Instead, we see natural, mindless processes, forces and elements coming together in a consistent sequence governed by natural laws. We don't see empty space being populated with planets and stars arranged in some intentional order. Instead, we see natural, mindless processes, forces, and elements coming together in a consistent sequence governed by these laws. When we play Big Bang cosmology backwards, we don't see a hand coming down from above. Whatever the heck that could possibly mean, we see matter and energy interacting according to physical laws, evolving naturally to form new matter over time. There's no mind behind two hydrogen atoms colliding together. We see no evidence of a mind when stars go supernova. Instead, we simply see the laws of physics playing out, just as our models predict, following natural rules that don't require the intervention of an external agent or designer.
A is for axiological. The axiological argument, most common form that we're familiar with, is the moral argument, but give us an example of an axiological argument for the existence of God.
So you have one of the traditional formulations today is that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. And the reason being, in a nutshell, is that when you look at the properties of morality, you see things that, it's something necessary, universal, transcendent, not dependent on us. And you look at the properties of morality, they're intrinsic to persons, not objects. Tables and chairs are not loyal or kind, persons are. So if morality exists, it must be grounded in something necessary, personal, and transcendent, namely something like God.
Okay, so let's break this down. Premise 1. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. Premise 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Conclusion, God exists. I have several issues with the syllogism. First, premise 1 assumes that objective moral values and duties are intrinsically linked to Eric Hernandez's God, but it offers no proof, no substance as to why that would be the case. It is a presupposition, not an argument. In terms of fallacies, this is begging the question, where the conclusion is already assumed in the premise. There are plenty of other ways to account for objective moral values, like the idea that they could be brute facts about the universe or grounded in rationality or human nature rather than an external divine mind. So Eric's God's existence is not required for the existence of objective moral values and duties. These are two separate concepts that require justification before we can even get to the first premise. The second premise is a bold presupposition that objective moral values and duties exist, but offers no substantive argument to back up this claim. This is a highly contested point in philosophy, with many arguing, myself included, that moral values are subjective and or socially constructed. Before making such a claim, the burden is on Eric here to prove that these objective moral values actually exist. These two problems make the syllogism's conclusion fallacious, either the is-ought fallacy or the non-sequitur fallacy, take your pick. Even if we grant the existence of objective moral values and duties, which is already a stretch considering greater minds than ours argue against such a thing, there's no reason to conclude that they must be grounded in a God. There are plenty of other potential explanations, and jumping straight to the conclusion that a God exists without considering those alternatives is philosophically and intellectually lazy. This syllogism failed to bridge the gap between moral values and the existence of a God, and much further investigation is required before we even get close to the first premise, let alone the conclusion.
And so, imagine Eric has a taco, and I want that taco. Can I brutally murder him and just take his taco from him? Or would that be objectively wrong? Why would it be wrong to murder Eric Hernandez for that taco?
Okay, first off, wow. Did you see Eric's face when his full name was used in conjunction with getting murdered for a taco? I feel like Eric is reevaluating his life choices here. So, rather than engaging honestly with the complexities of the moral debate, the presenter jumps straight to emotional manipulation, using loaded language to frame anyone who questions objective morality as some sort of psychopath. But this tactic misses the point. Challenging the idea of objective morality doesn't mean condoning murder, it means offering rational alternatives to how we understand moral behavior. The first part of his question is a false dichotomy. Can I murder him and take his taco? And is that objectively wrong? Are not the only two options in this scenario. It could also be relatively wrong, based on the norms and values of our society. Specifically, societies have evolved to establish rules that ensure social cohesion, like the idea that murdering someone for a taco is unacceptable. This is not an appeal to objective morality. It's a reflection of how humans, as social beings, have developed shared moral standards to protect each other. With a social species such as ours, if you do not want to be ostracized from society, which is a huge penalty that in the wild would guarantee your eventual demise, you won't kill people for tacos. Also, this is emotionally charged language. There is no reason for murder to come up in this scenario at all. If the point was to test the validity of objective morality versus relativism, the presenter could have just talked about stealing the taco, which is still considered wrong to many moral systems, including relativistic ones. But by jumping straight to murder, he's trying to make the argument more emotionally charged than it needs to be. This is a dishonest, manipulative tactic often used by those operating with narcissistic personality disorder. His question of, can I murder him or is that objectively wrong, leaves no room for an honest response. If I say anything but no, I am suddenly framing myself as a psychopath willing to condone murder over a taco. This is emotional blackmail, not a legitimate argument. The question is designed to force you to accept the premise of objective morality without considering the possibility that societies have their own way of preventing chaos without the need for divine mandates. Accept my premise or be condemned as a psychopath is not honest discourse. A more honest way to frame this question would be, without objective morality, what would prevent me from stealing Eric's taco? This, by the way, would also make Eric feel less concerned for his safety. Even in a relativistic view of morality, theft is still considered wrong in certain situations because we live in a society with shared values. There's no need to escalate to murder just to make a point. The question can still be explored rationally without resorting to emotional scare tactics. Also, I say theft is still wrong in certain conditions because in the relativistic view of morality, stealing food to survive, even if it is a $2 taco from Taco Bell, is generally considered acceptable, whereas in an objective moral framework, you're kind of just expected to starve.
Is it just culture? Could it change from one culture to another? Is it our personal preference? Is it our feelings?
Yes, morality changes not only from culture to culture, but even within the same culture over time. This doesn't mean that morality is based purely on feelings or preference. It's shaped by a combination of reason, empathy, societal norms, and evolving understanding of the human condition. We've witnessed our culture's shift in morality not just over grand timescales, but in our own lifetimes. For example, Statista shows that the public opinion on the death penalty has shifted dramatically in the early 1980s, from a high of 76% approval down to 55% today. This change reflects how social, legal, and cultural developments can reshape our moral landscape. And that's just in my lifetime. We've seen similar moral shifts on issues like homosexuality and transgender rights, which reflect society's growing understanding and empathy towards marginalized groups. These changes highlight how moral progress comes from a deeper engagement with the human condition. As time goes on, cultures change, and with it, so does our morality.
Or is it objectively morally wrong? If it's objectively morally wrong, then there is some sort of lawgiver who makes that a rule. And who is that?
Man, Taco Boy sure loves his false dichotomies, doesn't he? As I've said previously, even if I were to grant objective morality as some kind of brute fact of the universe, that is, something that exists without needing a higher explanation, it doesn't follow that an objective lawgiver or God exists. It could simply be a fact of nature that life cannot survive or evolve beyond the primordial soup stage without some level of cooperation. Evolution tends to favor behaviors that promote survival and reproduction, so cooperative behavior and moral norms could emerge as a natural result of how life evolves. That doesn't mean someone's sitting on a cloud and decreed it to be so. Even if we grant the idea of objective morality, which I'm decidedly not doing, you still have a huge gap to bridge to prove that it comes from a mind rather than just being the result of natural processes. This is the classic non sequitur fallacy. The idea that objective moral values require a divine lawgiver simply does not follow.
C is for cosmological. What would a cosmological argument for God's existence look like? And again, this is another argument where there are multiple forms of it over the centuries. Give us one.
So again, using Craig, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause.
Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause. Craig will himself then take the additional step to claim that this cause is God, though Craig will argue for this separately because his addition to the kalam is weak and spurious at best, and Craig, as a trained philosopher, knows this. Even if we were to grant the premise that the universe had a cause, this does not automatically lead us to a God. Back on topic, the kalam asserts that this universe began to exist. Did it, though? While the Big Bang model is well supported, it doesn't tell us what happened at t equals 0, or even if such a moment is meaningful. We only know what happens from the Planck time onward. That is, t equals 10 to the power of negative 43 seconds. Before that, both general relativity and quantum mechanics break down, leaving us with competing theories like cyclic universe or quantum cosmology, but no clear answers. The fact is that we don't know what happens at t equals 0. Suggesting a creation suggests knowledge of what happens at t equals 0. We simply do not know. In this case, the cosmological argument is guilty of a composition fallacy, assuming that what is true of its parts must also be true of the whole. We don't know if saying t equals 0 is a meaningful concept. Time as we understand it may not exist in that state. Some models, like eternal inflation or loop quantum gravity, suggest the universe didn't have a classical beginning at all. Side note, eternal inflation suggests that our universe is one of many pocket universes within a larger inflating multiverse, and loop quantum gravity proposes a quantization of space and time, preventing a singularity at the moment of the Big Bang. At these scales, we're not even sure that time behaves the way we currently understand it. We're not even sure if space behaves in a way we currently understand. A new theory outside of general relativity and quantum mechanics might be needed to be proposed, perhaps one that involves creating our own miniature universes from micro Big Bangs to study their effects. So the statement, the universe began to exist, may be meaningless because it assumes a linear progression of time, which may not apply in this case. We can only say that the universe exists and everything else is conjecture on our part. It may be that time extends infinitely in both directions, such as in the cyclic universe or the bouncing universe models, which propose that there is no singular beginning. It could be that the concept of space-time is no longer relevant and we have to discuss a new form of reality that encompasses a four-dimensional quantum dot that, for whatever reason, splits into space and time that is inexorably linked and yet separated into distinct quanta. My point is that we just don't know. To build a syllogism, and especially to leap from that syllogism to the existence of an almighty creator, rests on a lot of uncertain assumptions. While this doesn't disprove theism, it very much weakens the claim that the universe had a cause.
Now, to unpack the profundity of the argument, in philosophy, causes are logically prior to, external to, and greater than their effects. So, the person that caused this phone to exist or the camera to exist doesn't exist inside of it. Doesn't exist inside of the phone. And so if time, space, and matter had a beginning, you're going to need something transcendent to time, space, and matter. So something that would have been timeless, spaceless, and material, something unimaginably powerful, transcendent, and personal, to have the decision to create something out of nothing, and thus, once again, you have something like God.
So here we're anthropomorphizing a timeless, spaceless, immaterial entity and trying to compare human creators of physical objects to the creation conjecture. But here's the thing, humans create within the universe using pre-existing materials within space-time. The argument assumes that the properties of causes within the universe can be extended to causes outside the universe without justification. That's a fallacy of analogy. This analogy completely collapses when you try to extend it to an entity that allegedly exists outside of these constraints. You're making an assumption about a cause from a completely different realm without any basis in experience or observation, and to me, that's wild. This completely ignores the fact that everything we observe about the universe is within the universe. We don't even know if outside the universe is a coherent idea, let alone something we can meaningfully talk about. Occam's razor dictates that it's far more reasonable that if the universe has a cause, it's something natural we don't yet understand, rather than some entity that defies all of our empirical knowledge. Why is it more reasonable to assume that the universe's cause, if it has one, is a naturalistic process? Because that's what we have observed time and again of everything that has a cause. Naturalistic processes cause them to be. Therefore, I am more reasonable in assuming another natural series of events took place to cause the universe than to assume a supernatural event taking place. Does that mean that I assert this as the truth? No, that would be a fallacious category error. The universe is not something we've ever observed to be created, and as such, I cannot assert a truth claim here. However, what I can do is use this as my hypothetical assumption and my basis for empirical investigation. By the way, you do realize that when you say timeless, spaceless, immaterial, you're literally describing the empirical definition of a concept, right? Concepts don't do anything. They're tools for thinking, not causal actors in the universe. So you're essentially saying mere ideas or abstractions somehow cause the universe to exist. That's not just unreasonable, that's completely absurd. And then you take it one step further and claim that this timeless, spaceless, immaterial concept is also somehow unimaginably powerful, transcendent, and personal? There's no connection here. That is a complete non sequitur. You're essentially arguing that a concept which has no physical presence or causal power also has emotions, agency, and unlimited power. You are essentially arguing that God is an existential crisis.
So, this taco had a beginning. I'm going to give a quick series of disjunctive syllogisms, ladies and gentlemen. Either this taco had a beginning or it has existed forever. It hasn't existed forever. Therefore, this taco had a beginning. Since it had a beginning, we have another disjunctive syllogism. Either this taco began to exist as a result of some cause, or it began to exist uncaused. It's absurd to say that it began to exist uncaused. Therefore, this taco had a cause. And as Eric did, you can expand upon the sort of cause that would account for this taco. And, as we've seen, you can do that with the entire universe.
Okay, now we're getting more complex, and the first presenter's using fancy philosophy 101 words like disjunctive syllogism. Wow, such rigor, much philosophy. Okay, the first syllogism. Premise 1, either this taco had a beginning or it has existed forever. Premise 2, it hasn't existed forever. Conclusion, this taco had a beginning. This leads us to the second syllogism. Premise 1, either this taco began to exist as the result of some cause or it began to exist uncaused. Premise 2, it's absurd to say it began to exist uncaused. Conclusion: the taco's existence is caused. Combined conclusion: you can expand on the cause of the taco, a mind guiding this process, and extend it to the entire universe. I do not understand why this presenter has such a love affair with comparing the universe to tacos. Even this far into his video, he doesn't seem to understand that tacos are man-made objects assembled from discrete parts with intent and purpose, and the universe, as far as we can tell, is not. First, either the taco was created or it existed forever. The sarcastic bitch in me wants to say, but what if I eat the taco? Then it doesn't exist forever. Realistically, though, what he's actually saying is that the taco has existed infinitely into the past. The problem is that you can empirically prove that the taco does not extend infinitely into the past because tacos are man-made objects created from distinct parts with known origins. Moreover, we can demonstrate that the universe existed in a hot, dense state where our current understanding of physics breaks down, and a taco cannot exist in that state. Comparing the two is ridiculous. Since a taco cannot exist in this state, I propose my own nonsense syllogism. Premise 1. Tacos cannot exist beyond a certain point in time because it would be physically impossible according to the laws of quantum mechanics and general relativity. Premise 2. The universe can exist in this state, and scientific observations provide us with evidence that billions of years ago this was the case. Conclusion: a taco is not the universe. I can then follow this up with a second nonsense syllogism. Premise 1. A taco is not the universe. Premise 2. Tacos are created. Conclusion: there is no corollary here that can be used to suggest the universe was also created. And in case you're wondering, yes, I created a syllogism specifically to point out the category error of comparing the universe to a taco. The presenter is in fact making a basic category error by comparing man-made objects like a taco, which is subject to human intention and causality, with the universe, which follows natural laws. We simply cannot use the reasoning of the taco's creation and apply it to the origins of the universe. I recommend reading David Hume's criticisms of the design argument that shows the absurdity of comparing human artifacts to natural phenomenon. The presenter's syllogisms here are just lazy. This is like syllogisms for first graders. It's oversimplifying complex concepts, which results in begging the question. By comparing the universe to something as basic as a taco, he is sidestepping the real complexities of cosmology and the philosophical issues involved in talking about the universe's origins. Even without formal philosophic training, it's obvious that comparing something as trivial to a taco to the entire universe makes no sense. The universe is governed by natural laws and quantum phenomenon. Comparing that to the assembly of a taco is logically, argumentatively, and philosophically lazy.
O is for ontological. Lots of different ontological arguments, famously by people like Anselm, Plantinga has offered ontological arguments, but give us an example of an ontological argument for the existence of God.
Yeah, to simplify, because it can get a little complicated, but essentially, the entire argument hinges on the premise if it's possible that a maximal great being exists. So in philosophical terminology, if I say it is possible a maximal great being exists, I'm essentially saying that there is a possible world in which there is this thing we call a maximal great being. But once you allow that, then by definition, a maximal great being is going to exist necessarily in every possible world, including the actual world. So if it's possible a maximal great being exists, then necessarily a maximal great being exists in the actual world.
If it's possible, then a maximally great being if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, that means a maximally great being exists in a possible world, and a maximally great being that exists in a possible world would exist in all worlds.
That's right.
Or it wouldn't be maximally great. That's right.
This seems to be Plantinga's victorious modal ontological argument for the existence of God, as presented in The Nature of Necessity. If it's not, I apologize, but I'm going to go with what Little Crumbs Tweedledee and Tweedledork have left me. I won't critique Eric's particular phrasing here. Instead, I'll address Plantinga's argument, as Plantinga's phrasing is logically valid. That is, the steps follow the rules of modal logic, so if the premises are true, the conclusion holds. However, mere logical consistency doesn't prove the truth in reality. You can have an internally consistent argument, but if the conclusion is based on a false premise, it is fallacious. But the real problem is whether those premises can be shown to be true. Plantinga's argument is premise 1. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. Premise 2. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being necessarily exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds, then it necessarily exists in all possible worlds. Premise 4. If a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, then a maximally great being exists in the actual world. Conclusion. A maximally great being exists. The biggest problem, and quite likely the most hotly debated problem, is the question, does conception entail possibility? Followed closely by, does possibility equate necessity? Just because we can conceive of a maximally great being doesn't mean it's metaphysically possible. We can conceive of a lot of things, zombies, unicorns, werewolves, you name it, but that doesn't mean they're possible in reality. I can conceive of a world where the afterlife involves me resurrecting in the Marvel Universe as a member of the X-Men, but that doesn't mean my conception is possible. The zombie argument shows how we can conceive of beings exactly like us but without consciousness. The fact that we can imagine these beings doesn't mean they're metaphysically possible, which is why the connection between conception and possibility is so contentious. You can read the article Zombies in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, where the author dives into the problem of conception entailing possibility. It's a good introductory read into this problem. From an empirical standpoint, that is the standpoint that I take, I have to deny that conception alone entails possibility. Just because we can imagine something doesn't mean it's real, and until we have evidence or some way to test it, it remains a mere abstraction. Remember, concepts are just thoughts, ideas. In other philosophical frameworks where people argue that thoughts and ideas are concrete things, this is a thornier issue. But in the empirical world, abstractions, such as concepts, are not tangible, testable things. Thus, from an empirical point of view, I deny the very basic premise that it is possible that a maximally great being exists until it is empirically proven to exist. And a maximally great being should be empirically testable, wouldn't you agree? If not, if you insist that the all-powerful entity would leave no empirical trace of its existence, then we're forced to go down the divine hiddenness rabbit hole. And I'll remind you that divine hiddenness is no small philosophical journey and is considered a very strong challenge to theistic arguments because it directly undermines the idea that personal, all-powerful gods would allow people to remain ignorant of their existence, especially if knowing them is a moral or existential good. You could also object to my insistence for empirical evidence and claim that your all-powerful entity exists outside of space-time, but then you would need to explain that concept to me. As an atheist myself, you very much need to carefully define what outside space-time means. Otherwise, that concept makes you sound like a stark, raving mad, incoherent lunatic. Also, this argument can be inverted and the inverse conclusion can be reached. Premise 1. It is possible that a maximally great being doesn't exist. Premise 2. If it is possible that a maximally great being doesn't exist, then a maximally great being necessarily doesn't exist in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If a maximally great being doesn't exist in some possible worlds, then it necessarily doesn't exist in all possible worlds. Premise 4. If a maximally great being doesn't exist in all possible worlds, then a maximally great being doesn't exist in the actual world. Conclusion: a maximally great being doesn't exist. By inverting the argument, we can see the real problem. Plantinga's modal ontological argument starts from an unfounded premise. You can assert that it's possible for a maximally great being to exist or not exist, and both lead to opposite conclusions. This shows how the argument's premises can be manipulated without actually proving anything because the basis for a maximally great being is unfounded. Now, you might try and counter the negative here by saying that a maximally great being, by definition, cannot not exist, because then it wouldn't be maximally great. To which I would counter, you can't prove that a maximally great being could exist in the first place. The statement that it is possible a maximally great being exists is an unfounded, baseless assertion. So, in short, the modal ontological argument is an interesting philosophical and logical argumentation exercise, but it ultimately leads to no answers to anything. Without evidence or any way to test the premises, it ultimately fails to provide meaningful answers. And, since we can easily invert it, it's clear this argument isn't a robust way to prove the existence of a maximally great being. And now I'm going to have to listen to Taco Boy bring this conversation back down to a toddler level.
So, imagine a maximally great taco. These are the sorts of objections that atheists raise to the ontological argument for God because they don't understand the argument. So they would say something like, imagine a maximally perfect island or a maximally perfect taco. Guess what? You actually don't have a concept of a maximally great taco. There is no possible world in which a maximally great taco exists. Why? Because the properties that make a taco great aren't the sort of thing that you can just dial up to some level of perfection. Like how much meat would there be in a maximally great taco? You could say infinity, but then it's not a perfect taco. How's anyone going to eat a taco with infinite meat in it, or infinite lettuce, or infinite cheese? It doesn't work. So it wouldn't fit in a hand, which is part of what makes a taco great. So you can imagine a great taco. You cannot imagine a maximally great taco. We have no reason to think that something like that could possibly exist. And so the characteristics of something like this are different from the characteristics that are involved in our concept of God, where you can have maximally great goodness, maximally great power, maximally great knowledge. These are the characteristics of a maximally great being. And so we can say a maximally great being is possible. And if it's possible in some world, then a maximally great being exists in all worlds, including ours.
I could nitpick his argument and point out that he's committing a straw man fallacy by misrepresenting legitimate objections to the modal ontological argument. Analogies like the maximally great island are meant to show the limitations of the argument and illustrate the arbitrary nature of ascribing maximal properties to abstract concepts without justification. It's not meant to be taken literally. But here he's oversimplifying the critique to the point of absurdity. This straw man also ignores the relatively in-depth deconstruction I just provided, so I'm actually a little insulted. Instead, I'll point out that the defeater to his contention here is in his own statement. You cannot imagine a maximally great taco. If you cannot imagine a maximally great taco because the concept is a contradiction to the properties of a taco, then you cannot imagine a maximally great being because the concept of a maximally great being is, in itself, a contradiction. Consider omnipotence, the ability to do anything logically possible. Can this being create a stone so heavy that even it cannot lift? If so, it's not omnipotent. If not, it's not omnipotent. These contradictions show that the concept itself is incoherent. You might argue that it's not logically possible to create a stone that the omnipotent being cannot lift, thus violating the logically possible condition. But omnipotence intrinsically implies the ability to change how logic works. Otherwise, it is not omnipotence. It might be really strong, but omnipotent beings are not bound by outside influences. Now, Plantinga defines maximal greatness different than what our Goober says. Plantinga's definition of maximal greatness is far more rigorous than the oversimplified and infantile version presented here. By defining maximal greatness in terms of omnipotence, omniscience, moral perfection, and necessity, Plantinga sets up a more complex argument that has been seriously debated. The version we're hearing now avoids engaging with the real philosophical problems in order to pander to his audience. Plantinga says that a maximally great being is a being that includes omnipotence, the ability to do anything that is logically possible, omniscience, the ability to know everything that is knowable, moral perfection, being perfectly good or morally flawless, and necessity, the property of existing in all possible worlds. This goober, on the other hand, says a maximally great being possesses maximally great goodness, maximally great strength, and maximally great knowledge. Now, omnipotence and omniscience have been picked apart to death by greater minds than me, so I'd like to focus on moral perfection, or as Goober calls it, maximally great goodness. Maximally great goodness assumes moral perfection in every possible way, but moral dilemmas, like two starving people fighting over food, often have no perfect solution. Even if a being is omniscient and omnipotent, it still faces the problem that no action could satisfy all competing moral needs. This eventually brings us to the Euthyphro dilemma. Is something good because this being wills it, or does this being will it because it is good? We are then forced to ask ourselves what good actually is, and what is the definition of good to a maximally great being as compared to, say, us. You can try and sidestep the issue, but you're still left with the problem of unanswerable moral dilemmas. Moral dilemmas that the maximally great being, were it the God of the Bible, would judge you based on your actions. So, what's the correct answer? Remember, by definition, this maximally great being must be omnipotent and omniscient. So this being must know the correct answer. There must be a correct answer if omniscience and moral perfection are to be upheld. But thanks to the property of omnipotence, the maximally great being can only do things that are logically possible. It is logically impossible to have a morally perfect answer in this hypothetical situation. Moral perfection implies a clear hierarchy of moral values, but in the real world, moral values often conflict, i.e., justice versus mercy. No matter how maximally great a being acts, it will fail to satisfy one value, violating the condition of moral perfection. If moral perfection is logically impossible in real-world situations, then the idea of a maximally great being that possesses moral perfection becomes incoherent. And if one of the core attributes is impossible, the entire concept of a maximally great being falls apart. Therefore, there can be no such thing as moral perfection. As such, there can be no such thing as a maximally great being. By the way, the two starving people scenario isn't just a hypothetical. This is something that plays out every day in our real world. It's not just a philosophical dilemma, it's a real, legitimate problem with no solution in our current socio-economic model. And of course, from here we could delve into theodicy, the problem of evil, that is, real-world suffering challenges the coherence of a morally perfect omnipotent being. We could also challenge the idea of omniscience, since moral perfection means that being must be omniscient, but then that contrasts with the Christian worldview of free will, which adds to the overall incoherence of the concept these two are arguing for. Well, that's it for Tweedledee and Tweedledork here. Eric obviously has some background or training, even if he's self-taught, in theological argumentation. I wonder if the reason he's trapped in the basement this video was made in is because the NPD psychopath kidnapped him and forced him to eat tacos with him.